We have a very interesting paper by Xiaoyan, Zacharias, Sautner, Jing, and Zhong. This is very topical because it deals with the European taxonomy, that is a very controversial piece of legislation, as you know, and that may be interesting also for colleagues from the US because this is a piece of legislation that may have the so-called Brussels effect, or at least some content in this sense. So I think that the rules of the game are the same. You have 20 minutes, then 10 minutes for the discussion and the Q&A. So please.
Thank you. I'm Xiaoyan from University of Oxford. Good morning, and I will present today our working paper on the EU taxonomy and the syndicated loan market. So to achieve the net zero carbon emission objectives, the Paris Agreement advocate the two roles that investors need to play to align the investment towards towards sustainable investment through carbon. Okay. Yeah, sorry. So the Paris Agreement advocate two roles of the investors actually to making finance flow towards a pathway to a low greenhouse or carbon emission and also climate resilient development. And the existing literatures mainly study the questions of how the investor respond to the green investment from focusing on the carbon emission perspective. And the introduction of the green taxonomy allows us to actually study this question from a climate resilient development perspective using the EU taxonomy aligned activities. So what is the EU green taxonomies? So it is actually a system of classification or labeling. Sorry. What happened? Someone?
I think that we are facing a problem.
Next.
It may happen on Zoom.
Okay. So the green taxonomy is actually a classification system which defines which activities, business activities, is a sustainable activities that in lines with climate objectives in the EU. And the benefits is sort of clear that because the EU taxonomy provides a common criteria of sustainable activities, and this labeling which activity or finance product are green. So this allows the investors to identify the green products or green business activities. In that case, they will channel the investment towards the resource resilient business activities. So this slide shows the overview of the development of taxonomies worldwide. So we can see that some countries, they already had green taxonomies exist. For example, EU, China, and some other countries are developing their own taxonomies, including UK. So the mainly mandatory use of the green taxonomies in EU is that the new proposal for the EU Green Bond Standard, which requires the 100% use of the proceeds to use in line with EU taxonomy business activities. Also in China, the use of green industry guiding category also used in green bond and green loan as well. So at the core of the EU taxonomy regulation is that to not only to ask or require the firms and financial firms or non-financial firms to disclose to the extent to which their business activities aligns with EU taxonomy, and also to disclose the green revenue, like the percentage or the shares of green revenue, so the shares in their capital expenditures and also in their cost operation as well. So our research questions include that we will investigate whether banks had priced in some of the effect of taxonomy-aligned business activities. If so, what are the underlying mechanisms, and also how do firms actually adjust their capital structures? These are the research questions. And our summary of main findings that we found that banks actually do charge a lower spread on loans to firms with more share of transitional revenues. And also, we identified two channels. This could explain this result from climate risk management perspective and a lender's green preference perspective. In addition, we also found that firms with more green revenue or transitional revenue aligned with taxonomy, actually they reduce more emissions and also develop more green innovations. And also firms with more transitional revenues, they have long-term debt and they tend to finance through bank loans as well. So our main contributions of this study is that we contribute or extend the literature on the bank lending effects of climate change, and we're focusing on climate resilience perspective reflected by green taxonomy aligned business activities. And we also made several policy implications, and our study actually captures a meaningful heterogeneity across firms in terms of how firms respond to climate change, and also we found or captured some of the taxonomy effect has probably already been priced in before the introduction of EU taxonomy. And the actual or the eventual effect could be much larger than what we have documented. So to conduct this study, we use a new data set, which is SP True Cost EU Taxonomy Revenue Share data set. So True Cost, actually they calculated the shares, like the firm revenues, based on the EU taxonomy aligned business activities. And they split this revenues into two core measures. The first one is transitional revenues, and based on the part of revenue generated from transitional business activities, and also the enabler revenues. This is part of revenue generated from enabling activities. The difference is that the transitional revenue actually is a fraction of revenue associated with the activities that made significant contribution to the climate change mitigation. However, the enabling revenues actually is the business activity that allows other firms to contribute to the climate objectives. So just to give a simple example to show the difference, for example, the use of solar panel will categorize as transitional revenue. However, the production of the solar panel will be categorized as enabling revenues. And also we use the syndicated loan data from DLScan. And so in the study, we documented over 14,000 loan facilities from 2005 to 2018 and across 36 countries. So we ran our baseline regressions at the facility levels. We controls for both loan level and firm level characteristics, and also control some loan purpose country effect in our study. So this table shows the summary statistics, and we can tell the transitional revenue, the average of transitional revenue is about 0.23, and the enabler revenue is much lower at 0.13. However, notably, we can say that like over half of the firms, they have zero transitional revenue. which could probably indicate that many of the firms still at the early stage combating on climate change. And this table just shows our May findings. For the full sample, we documented that one standard deviation increase in transitional revenue associated with to a 6 basis point increase in loan cost, which is relevant about 4% increase relative to the sample mean. If we convert into the cost reduction, it could indicate like 0.54 million cost reduction per loan. This funding is consistent whether we control or without control for the various fixed fact, and also for the whole sample period or between different sample period. We also did several robustness tests. So in panel A, we test whether this cost reduction effect of transitional revenue, it is just transit or is long term. So we show that this transitional revenue effect is actually long term. And also in panel B, we are controlling for carbon emissions. The result is consistent. Also, we did show that carbon emission has a significant effect on the loan spread, positive effect on the loan spread. In panel C, we also split our sample by EU firms on non-EU firms, and we found that while the EU, the significant effect of transitional revenue is much more pronounced for EU firms relative than the non-EU firms. We're also looking at the transitional revenue effect on the other non-pricing terms, including the loan covenants, loan maturity, collateral, and loan amount. And we didn't find any effect on the loan covenant or loan maturities, but we did find transitional revenue negatively affect the collaterals, and also we also found that transitional revenue have a negative effect on loan mod. So the more transitional revenue, they tend to finance with a smaller amount of loan. We then investigate the channels or the mechanisms behind this transitional revenue effect on the loan spread. So first of all, in order to explain whether the carbon or the environmental policy is the driver behind the relationship between the transitional revenue and loan spread, we split our country based on the environmental policy stringency using the OECD policy stringency index. And now we have two subsamples. One is the high environmental policy stringency, the lower, below the medium sample are the lower environmental policy stringency. We found that the transitional revenue effect on loan spread is more pronounced, and the size of the effect more pronounced and more high magnitude in the country for the firms located in the countries with the higher policy stringency. We also investigate whether this effect or cost reduction effect of transitional revenue actually varies across firms with different country level physical climate risks. And our result also shows that the transitional revenue effect on loan spread is more pronounced in those countries that are exposed to higher physical risks. So in this table we did like 3 three-way difference in difference. We test whether carbon tax actually could also explain some of the result. So our finding shows that the transitional revenue effect on the loan spread actually is much more pronounced after the introduction of carbon tax, and especially for those firms that has a credit ratings lower than BBB, lower ratings. So we then look at the second channels or the mechanisms to explain the relationship negative, the cost reduction effect of transitional revenue through the lender's perspective. And so we divided the lenders into EP, which is the equity principal signatory or not, or are they PRR signatory or not. And we found that the lenders with a strong green preference, for example, if they're signatory of equity principal or they're signatory of PRR, they actually intend to issue like a lower cost loan spread to the firms with more transitional revenues. We also did environmental. We also checked the environmental response of the transitional revenue effect. We found that transitional revenue actually firms tend to have a lower emission reduction and also have a more green innovation indication. This table shows our financial response. Like we looking at whether transitional revenue effect. And we found that is more tend to have long-term loans, and also they tend to finance through the bank loan as well. So our conclusion is that this study we demonstrate that at least in the past, before the introduction of EU taxonomy, the sustainable activities already actually has been priced by the lender, the banks, and the effects are more pronounced for firms in countries with greater regulatory and environmental policy stringency and more exposure to physical risk. And when lending institutions have a green preferences. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Just quickly going through the text.
So let me first thank the organizers. I'm very glad to be here and to take part in this nice event. And I'm also very glad to have had the opportunity to read this quite stimulating paper. Xiaoyan did a very good job presenting the content, so I'll be brief on the summary part. So this paper tackles an important issue because the EU taxonomy is a major step forward for kind of decarbonizing our economies, I think. And we will need, of course, assessment studies to evaluate whether it works, to what extent, what we could improve, and so on. And this paper also is kind of pioneering this future literature. It exploits a new data set built by TrueCost, which, as Xiaoyan explained, provide us with a measure of the share of a firm's business which is consistent with the taxonomy or aligned on the taxonomy, which is green, to put it bluntly. Okay? So they find that in the past, firms with larger share of taxonomy-aligned activities, let's call it TR, transitional revenue share. In the past, firms with a larger transitional revenue share had also smaller loan spreads when issuing loans on the syndicated loan markets. The effect is larger in the EU and in riskier countries in terms of transitional and physical climate risks, and they also explore some channels to kind of understand what happens behind the scene. So let me first say a few words of praise. I think it's an important contribution. The first empirical assessment of the potential impact of the EU taxonomy here on firms' borrowing costs. It's a topical issue. The policy implications are potentially large. And they use new data, which is always nice, provide a rich set of variants and so on. Let me go now to the comments, because my role is to kind of challenge the results presented and make suggestions that hopefully can help the authors going further. So I will have 5 types of comments. First, about the interpretation of the exercise, about the main variable, transitional revenue share, about the baseline regression and its variance, about an exercise which was just swiftly presented, so maybe I'll be quicker on this and we can exchange on this bilaterally, and about the mechanisms. So we'll see how I can deal with time. First, I'd like to start with a general comment. I think it's not that easy to interpret the exercise, and I guess and my feeling is that you may spend a bit more time trying to explain what's your reading of what you're doing to the reader. So basically, you use data that kind of backpolate the EU taxonomy. What I mean is data that reconstruct backward what the taxonomy would imply today. Okay, so how can we interpret that? Does that mean that banks in the past could guess what activities would be flagged as transitional by the EU taxonomy today? Probably not. So then, if it's not the case, why would firms with a higher share of taxonomy-aligned activities, why would these firms be perceived as less risky by the market, by banks in particular? So we will need you to kind of elaborate a bit more on this to give more clout to the exercise. Is this just because the transitional revenue share is very correlated to Scope 1 emissions? So some of the results presented suggest maybe not, because when you include these Scope 1 emissions, you still have some significant coefficient for your main variable. So, but this deserves more explanations. And in the same vein, I think it would greatly improve the paper if you would provide us with a lot more of description of this new variable. So basically, this paper is centered on exploits a new variable nobody has seen before, which is constructed by true cost. So I guess maybe there are true cost persons here, so I guess they are very competent guys. But, well, they provide us with a new data set. What is it worth? How did they construct it? And so on. So for instance, we would like to have more details on the way it's constructed. So basically, I understand that suppose a firm has business in 2 industries, a green one and a brown one. So the share of transitional revenues is the share of profits or operating income in the green part. But what are these industries? What is the detail? Are there 2-digit industries, 4-digit industries in the next classification? Is it enough to characterize taxonomy-aligned activities? So you told us in some part of the paper that, well, it's not just about running trains, it's about running specific types of trains, which, for instance, use electricity and not coal or whatever. So there are much more details in the way the taxonomy is defined. So we would like more explanations. And we would like also to figure out better what this variable looks like. Is the way it is distributed intuitive? So we would like to see figures on the average level of the TR variable and its dispersion through time, by regions. Is it variable within firm or not, or is it pretty much constant? Is it variable across broad industries and so on? So it would help a lot. Maybe this would end up being in the online appendix, but nevertheless, it would enrich our understanding. And further, I think it would be useful to also provide more description of the data. For instance, I couldn't find how many firms you have in the sample. So you focus on the number of observations, so loan observations, but Does a firm appear just one, issue one loan, and then it's enough for the 15 years of data, or are some firms issuing dozens of loans and so on? And so on. So I don't want to dwell too much on that. And we would like also to have a correlation matrix of this transitional revenue share with the firm level controls to better understand what's at stake. Let me come now to the main regression, where, to put it simply, we try to see whether loan spreads at issuance are explained by the true cost variable, transitional revenue share at the firm level. So we have to keep in mind that what you're doing here is kind of measuring correlations, not claiming for causality, and I think you're quite honest on that, so you're always quite cautious in the way you express it. So then the issue question that remains is, could you go further at some point in the paper and go for more, for a stricter identification of causal effects? But we'll see. Whatever, already at this stage, you may kind of test further things like controlling better for macro shocks by including country time fixed effects, which is easy. You may also exploit the structure of your data set by, in some variants, including bank time fixed effects. And this would be interesting because we would compare then firms which borrow from the same bank, and if the effect remains, if the coefficient of the variable of interest is still significant, this means that this is really something coming from the firms, not from the banks. Also, when you include industry or fixed effect, implicitly you're looking at a best-in-class approach. Is it really what you want to do? Maybe you should comment on that. And so it means, okay. And another point is the role of the Paris Agreement. So I was a bit struck by your results that kind of the effect of the TER variable is constant through time. So if you look at early years, later years. And it seems to me that it comes a bit in contrast with results in the literature that find that the Paris Agreement was a turning point. For instance, this paper by Laura Starks and co-authors, where they find that bond spreads of highly carbon-intensive firms are higher after Paris Agreement than before in the US. So how can we reconcile these facts? What happens? Okay, 2 minutes. So. Then there's the part on the defensive. So at some point, and maybe this is work in progress, at some point you suggest that you could use the introduction of carbon taxes in some countries as a defensive setup. I'm not sure I think there is still more work on that. So I'm not sure it's the right way to do it. Looking at a figure you didn't show, but you have a figure somewhere where you show that when the carbon tax kicks in, the transitional revenue share on average increases. So it's not very much in the definitive spirit, because in the definitive spirit we would have looked at how spreads diverge when the carbon tax kicks in. So maybe what you have in mind is more a kind of instrumental variable setup, this two-stage regression setup. So, and you're looking for an instrument, and then the question arises: is the carbon tax a good instrument? Is it a bit anticipated by firms? Could you use other country-specific indexes like the EPS from the ECD you're using, or the climate change performance index of German Watch, for instance? And if really what you intend to do is a definitive setup, maybe you should follow on other papers and use the introduction of the Paris Agreement as a kind of treatment without having some complications associated with staggered treatment as you have here. So, but maybe it's too technical for. And the last point is on the channels and mechanisms. So you find that the transitional revenue share has a larger impact on spreads when banks have signed in some coalitions, like PRI. How can we interpret that? Does this really point at banks' green preferences, or does this point at their perception of risk, of climate risk? We may think that when a bank signs into such coalition, it it means that this bank is much more conscious of the climate risk also. So maybe you need to kind of go further or deeper on that. Thank you. And
thank you very much for your comments. I am sure that you want to react to the
and again,
many
congratulations.
comments you received. But maybe before we can open the floor to the audience to get questions, I'm sure that there are someone that want to ask questions. Are there? Yes. So you can answer at the end to the discussant and to the public.
Hi. As you use loan syndicated data, have you thought to look at credit supply to understand whether, say, reduction in the cost of funding for, say, more green firms comes along with more credit, or maybe there is only a pricing effect and no credit supply effect? Is this something that may be of interest for you to investigate?
Sorry, you mentioned credit loan supply, credit supply.
Yeah, yes, because you look at the spread, right? You look at the pricing effect.
Yeah.
So have you thought of also looking at the loan amount, so whether loan amount increased or decreased as an effect of...
Oh,
so, yeah.
no, okay.
Maybe we have time just for another question.
Because you have the data to do so.
Yeah, thank you.
So is it that you can answer to the question?
Yeah, we will look, I think we will look at the changes in the loan amount to reflect the credit loan supply and see if this explains the result. Or yeah, thank you.
Yes, maybe you want to react to the...
Yes, thank you for your great comments. And this is our first draft, and this is still at early stage. And then we understand. Thanks. I think all your comments are very helpful. There's so many things need to address from the data description, explaining more about the new data set and how to actually align or marry or calculate the transitional revenue, and how exactly the traditional revenue exactly matching the transitional activity, and how to explain the result of this before the EU taxonomy is introduced. Anyway, whereas this is so great, and we will keep on working to improve our paper. Thank you.
I have just a question, because you backdated the taxonomy, basically, your paper, but now the European Central Bank is trying to integrate ESG factors in banking capital rules. So that should be another shock that you
Yeah.
I think so. Because
And we also thinking to trying to explain maybe before the taxonomy introduced that some of the activity, sustainable activities already exist. It's just sometimes hard to measure, to quantify, and we need to find a way, to really explain the effect.
So thank you very much to both
Thank
of
you.
you, and thank you very much.